The sound was what he remembered most. Not the sight of rock and earth swallowing the sky, but the sound, a deep, guttural groan from the belly of the mountain, a final terrible exhalation as timbers splintered like dry bones. It was a sound that had lived in his ears for 5 years, a constant echo in the quiet moments. 5 years ago, Silas Ward was a different man. Hope had been a tangible thing, something he could see in his wife's smile and feel in the small, trusting grip of his daughter's hand. He was a foreman, then respected steady. He believed in hard work and the solid promise of the earth beneath his feet. The memory always returned with the smell of dust and the taste of panic. He was at the mouth of the Oak Haven mine, shouting names into the churning cloud of debris. His own name felt foreign on his tongue, a useless word against the mountain's roar. Men were screaming, running their faces, masks of white terror in the gray gloom. But Silas was digging. His hands, not yet softened by years of calculated inaction, tore at the rubble bleeding and raw against the sharp edges of shattered rock and splintered pine. They tried to pull him away. "It's no good, Silas. The whole shaft is gone." The voices were distant, muffled by the ringing in his ears and the frantic pounding of his own heart. He shook them off, driven by a singular, desperate prayer. He had seen Sarah run toward the mine office just moments before the collapse, a paper Daisy clutched in her hand, a gift for her father. His wife Mary was right behind her. He kept digging his mind a white void of denial. He called their names until his throat was raw, the words lost in the settling groans of the earth. And then his fingers brushed against something small, fabric-covered, and cold. He cleared the dirt with a tenderness that defied the chaos around him, his breath catching in his chest. It was a hand. A child's hand, impossibly still. Clutched tightly within its small fist was a silver locket one he had given her for her 6th birthday. He remembered her laughter as he'd fastened it around her neck, her bright eyes promising a future that had just been stolen. He didn't have to dig any further. He knew. Mary was there too, buried beneath tons of rock, their shared life extinguished in a single, violent moment. That was when the fight left him. He didn't struggle as the other miners finally pulled him back, their grips firm and sorrowful on his arms. He simply stared at the place where his world had ended, the image of that small, lifeless hand seared into his memory. The hope that had defined him was gone, replaced by a cold, quiet purpose that would take 5 years to harden into a weapon. Now, 5 years later, that memory flickered behind his eyes as he loaded the last of his meager possessions onto a broken-down wagon. His hands meticulously clean and soft, looked out of place against the faded patches of his shirt. It was an intentional disguise, a role he had perfected. Margaret stood on the porch of the house that was once theirs, her laughter sharp and brittle in the morning air. "Look at him," she called to her neighbor, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Moving to that cursed place with his fancy box and poor man's clothes." The cursed place was a derelict property everyone called the Dead Ranch, a patch of barren ground that had broken every man who tried to tame it. The fancy box was a heavy iron-strapped chest that seemed to mock the poverty of his other belongings. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't hurry or look away in shame. He set the chest down with deliberate care, his movements steady and precise. For a moment his gaze met hers across the dusty yard, and the cold stillness in his eyes made her laughter falter. It was a look she had never seen before, not grief, not defeat, but something far more dangerous. Patience. She couldn't see the letter from a Denver bank tucked inside his coat, its contents holding the power to dismantle her world. She didn't know that the Dead Ranch had been purchased by a corporation she'd never heard of with funds she couldn't comprehend. All she saw was the man she had cast aside, a failure she could mock to elevate her own standing. As Silas finally turned his wagon toward the horizon, he allowed himself a small, mirthless smile, a secret he kept from the world. Margaret thought she was watching a broken man retreat into his final humiliation. In truth, she was witnessing the first move in a war he had been planning for 1,825 days. The dead ranch was more than a name. It was a promise of failure. It sat in a vast, unforgiving basin, where the sun bleached the very color from the sky, leaving only shimmering heat and the ghost of a horizon. The wind was a constant, mournful presence, whispering through the skeletal remains of cottonwood trees and carrying the fine, alkaline dust that coated everything in a layer of pale grit. The fence posts, bleached gray and split by years of heat and cold, leaned like tired old men surrendering to the inevitable. Weeds tough and thorny had conquered the corral, their tangled roots choking the life from the soil. The barn was a carcass, its spine broken, one side of its roof caved in as if punched by the fist of a giant. Silas guided the weary horse and wagon onto the property, the wheels crunching over sun-baked earth. He felt, rather than saw, Margaret's eyes on his back, a pinprick of scorn from across the valley. She would be standing on her pristine porch, perhaps tapping her polished riding crop against her boot in sharp, impatient rhythm, her nose wrinkled in disdain at the dust he kicked up. She had always hated the dirt. He brought the wagon to a halt before the sagging porch of the ranch house. With the same deliberate care he'd shown earlier, he lowered the heavy chest to the warped floorboards. From his pocket, he produced a new brass key, its shine an anomaly in this world of decay. The lock on the old door turned with a well-oiled click. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of disuse, stale dust, dry rot, and the faint, unsettling scent of long-dead rodents. Sunlight pierced the grime-caked windows in weak, hazy shafts, illuminating a world of neglect. But Silas saw none of it. His focus was singular. He knelt and opened the chest. There were no clothes, no sentimental keepsakes from a lost life. There were only papers, stacks of them bound in oilcloth and tied with string. Legal documents bearing the official seals of 3 territories. Land deeds for properties scattered across the mountains, their locations chosen with a geologist's precision. Investment certificates in mining operations and burgeoning railroad lines. Bank statements from Denver, Santa Fe, and Cheyenne, their columns of figures representing a fortune built in silence and shadow. At the very bottom lay a worn leather journal, its pages filled with neat, precise columns of calculations and geological notations of the blueprint for his resurrection. For 2 years, he had worn his poverty like a shield. Every shabby coat, every plea for leniency in the divorce settlement, every quiet, defeated nod as Margaret and her lawyer stripped him of their shared assets, had been a calculated move. She had wanted to believe he was worthless, a man whose ambition had died with his family. He had simply given her the performance she expected. Now she was gone, and the performance was over. His eyes fell upon a specific set of survey maps detailing the geological strata of this very valley. They showed fault lines, mineral deposits, and most importantly, the precise location of the Oakhaven mine. His mine, the place where his life had been shattered. A shadow fell across the doorway, and Silas looked up, his hand instinctively moving to cover the papers. It was Eli Thompson, his closest neighbor, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and hardship. Eli was one of the few who had offered a quiet word of support during the divorce, his loyalty as solid and unpretentious as the land he worked. Silas. Eli said, his voice a low rumble. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated interior before settling on his friend. Figured you could use a hand settling in. Though I can't imagine what you see in this place. Before Silas could reply, another figure appeared on the dusty track leading to the ranch. A man on a fine, dark horse, dressed in a city suit that was as out of place here as Silas's own clean hands. He rode with an easy confidence, an air of ownership. He stopped his horse near Margaret's property line, surveying the valley with an appraising eye. "Who's that?" Eli asked, squinting against the glare. "That," Silas said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "is Lawrence Blackwood." Eli's expression soured. "The landman from Denver. Heard he's been sniffing around making offers. Been paying particular attention to Margaret. Whispers been he's promising her the moon, talking about development, a new town." He looked from the sophisticated stranger to Silas. "Something about him ain't right. He smiles too much for a man just looking at dirt." Blackwood dismounted and approached Margaret's porch, removing his hat with a practiced charming gesture. Even from this distance, Silas could see the way Margaret responded, her posture straightening, a practiced smile appearing on her face. Blackwood was a predator, cloaking his intentions in charisma and ambition, and he was subtly encouraging Margaret to be the jackal that drove Silas from this last patch of ground. Silas watched them, his expression unreadable. The journal in the chest, a silent testament to a truth Blackwood thought he had buried forever. The game was far more complex than a simple land grab. It was a reckoning, and it had been 5 years in the making. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the bruised purple mountains in hues of orange and gold, when the sound of an approaching rider broke the stillness. It wasn't the casual gait of a neighbor, but the purposeful rhythm of official business. Sheriff Brody reined in his horse, the leather of his saddle creaking in protest. His face, usually set in a look of weary tolerance, was grim. "Silas," he said, forgoing any pleasantries as he dismounted. He held out a folded piece of paper. "It's a formal notice. 3 years of back taxes on this property." Eli, who had been helping Silas pry a rotted board from the porch, stopped his work, his brow furrowed with concern. 3 years, but he just took possession. Doesn't matter who holds the deed now. The sheriff explained, his eyes on Silas, gauging his reaction. "The debt stays with the land. Margaret and her new associate, Mr. Blackwood, filed the complaint personally this morning. They're aiming for a public auction." Silas took the paper, his expression unreadable. He scanned the document, his gaze lingering on the neatly printed figures and the 2 signatures at the bottom, Margaret Ward and Lawrence Blackwood. There was no surprise in his posture, no flash of anger or fear. It was the calm of a man who had anticipated his enemy's move long before it was made. Blackwood. Silas said, his voice low and steady, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "The man from Denver. I imagine he's already made an offer on the land should it go to auction." "More than that," the sheriff admitted, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "He's the one who provided the county with the anonymous tip about the delinquency in the first place. Put the idea right in Margaret's head. He's playing her like a fiddle." Eli spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "I told you. He's been whispering in her ear for weeks, Silas. Talking about progress, about how this eyesore of a ranch is holding back the valley's potential. All smiles and fancy words, but his eyes are cold as a snake's." Eli lowered his voice, though there was no one else to hear. "Something about him ain't right. He wants this piece of dirt way too much." Silas folded the notice and tucked it into his shirt pocket. The threat was real now, no longer a matter of Margaret's scorn, but a legal mechanism set in motion by the very man he had come here to destroy. This wasn't just about land. It was about the secrets buried beneath it. Blackwood wasn't just a charismatic developer. He was a ghost from Silas's past, a man connected to the Oak Haven mine in ways no one in this valley could possibly imagine. "Don't you worry, Sheriff." Silas said, his tone so devoid of panic it seemed to unnerve the lawman. The county will get its money. Sheriff Brody nodded, though his expression remained troubled. You've got 30 days. After that, it's out of my hands. I'm sorry, Silas. You're just doing your job, Silas replied. As the sheriff rode away, Eli turned to his friend, his face etched with worry. What are you going to do? Now, that's a pile of money, Silas. Even if you sold that fancy chest of yours, it wouldn't cover it. Silas looked past him, his gaze fixed on the distant silhouette of the Oak Haven mine, a dark scar against the vibrant sunset. Blackwood has made his move. He said more to himself than to Eli. Now it's my turn. He was not just fighting to save a ranch. He was fighting to unearth a crime buried under 5 years of silence and a mountain of rock. The tax notice was not the end. It was the beginning. The next morning, Silas rode into town. He didn't go to the bank to plead for a loan or to a saloon to drown his sorrows. He went to the county records office, a squat, stuffy building that smelled of aging paper and stale ink. The clerk, a young man named Peterson with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, looked up as Silas entered. Here to settle the account on the old Miller place? Peterson asked, already reaching for a ledger. Mr. Blackwood was just in ensuring the paperwork was in order for the auction. I'm here to pay it, Silas said calmly, placing a bank draft on the counter. The amount was for the full sum plus penalties. Peterson's eyes widened at the Denver bank's insignia and the neat, confident signature. He stammered for a moment before clumsily stamping the document, paid in full. But Silas did not move to leave. I need to see some other records, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I'd like the original land surveys for this entire valley going back 20 years. The clerk blinked. All of them. That's a lot of material, Mr. Ward. Is there a specific parcel you're interested in? All of them, Silas repeated. And one other thing. I need the official territorial accident report for the Oak Haven mine collapse, the one from 5 years ago. A flicker of fear crossed Peterson's face. He began shuffling papers on his desk, avoiding Silas's gaze. The mine report, I don't know, Mr. Ward. That was a long time ago. A lot of those old territorial files, they get misplaced. It's a public record. Silas stated, his calm demeanor hardening into something more formidable. It can't be misplaced. I'll have to look in the archives. The clerk mumbled, his hands trembling slightly. It could take days. He scurried into a back room, leaving Silas alone in the dusty silence. While he waited, Silas stood by the window, which offered a clear view of the town's main street. He saw Margaret exit the general store, her arms full of parcels. A moment later, Lawrence Blackwood emerged from the assayer's office across the street. He didn't approach Margaret. Instead, he moved toward a man who had been leaning against the shaded boardwalk, a man Silas had never seen before. The stranger was built like a brawler, with a hard face and watchful eyes. As he shook Blackwood's hand, the sunlight glinted off something on his finger, a heavy silver ring intricately carved, with an insignia Silas recognized instantly. It was the emblem of the Atlas Mining and Exploration Company, the corporation that had owned the Oak Haven mine. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was the first tangible link, a solid thread, connecting the charming developer from Denver to the day his world had ended. This wasn't a coincidence. Peterson returned from the back room, his face pale and beaded with sweat. I'm sorry, Mr. Ward, he stammered, wringing his hands. I looked everywhere. The file, the official report from the mine collapse. It's missing. Missing. Silas echoed the word hanging in the air like a death sentence. He looked from the terrified clerk to the men on the street outside. Blackwood was handing the stranger a thick envelope of cash. The transaction was quick, discreet, but Silas saw it all. The missing report wasn't an administrative error. It was a deliberate erasure of history. Silas gave the clerk a slow, deliberate nod. "Thank you for your time." He turned and walked out of the office, his mind racing. He now had the pieces: a land-hungry developer with a hidden past, a hired man wearing the old company ring, and a conveniently vanished official record. This was no longer just suspicion. It was the beginning of a trail, and Silas knew with chilling certainty exactly where it would lead. Back to the mountain. Back to the day of the collapse. Back to the murder of his family. Within a week, the valley was transformed. A convoy of heavy freight wagons, their canvas tops billowing in the wind, rumbled toward the dead ranch. They were not filled with the meager supplies of a desperate homesteader, but with the tools of industry surveying transits, coils of steel cable, crates of dynamite, and stacks of fresh-cut lumber. A crew of 20 hard-faced men, their movements efficient and professional, began to unload the materials under the direction of a foreman who answered only to Silas. The town watched in stunned silence. Margaret, observing from her porch through a spyglass, felt a knot of cold dread tighten in her stomach. This was not the act of a man struggling to survive. It was the work of a man building an empire. The scale of the operation was staggering. Surveyors weren't just marking the boundaries of the old ranch. They were staking out a wide corridor that cut directly through the center of the valley. The initial shock gave way to a wave of frantic speculation. Rumors flew through town like wildfire. Silas had struck gold. He was building a massive cattle operation. He had secretly inherited a fortune. Margaret, fueled by a mixture of fury and humiliation, confronted Eli Thompson at the general store. "What is he doing?" she demanded. "Where did he get that kind of money?" Eli simply shrugged, a faint knowing smile playing on his lips. "Looks to me like he's building something, Margaret. Maybe you should have asked more questions before you decided he wasn't worth your time." What no one in the valley could see was the true nature of the work. While one crew began laying the preliminary groundwork for a railroad depot, a second, smaller team operated with greater secrecy. Under the guise of geological surveying, they moved toward the foothills, their destination the scarred and abandoned entrance to the Oak Haven mine. They weren't looking for a path for a railroad. They were taking core samples, mapping the strata, and discreetly re-examining the site of the collapse. That evening, Robert Hayes, the banker from Denver, arrived once more. He and Silas sat not in the dilapidated ranch house, but in a newly erected canvas office, a map of the valley spread between them on a rough pine table. Their conversation was not about profit and loss. It was about justice. "My investigators have been thorough." Hayes said, his voice low and serious. He pushed a folder across the table. "Inside, you'll find copies of the original Atlas mining safety inspections for the 6 months prior to the collapse. Every single one was forged. The signatures don't match the territorial inspectors, and the geological stability reports were falsified." Silas opened the folder. His hands were steady as he examined the documents. "There's more," Hayes continued. "We tracked down 3 miners who were fired by Atlas in the weeks before the disaster. Their testimonies are sworn and notarized. They all state they raised concerns about the structural integrity of the main support beams in Shaft 4, the very shaft that collapsed. They were dismissed for insubordination. The final piece of evidence was a complex diagram of financial transactions. "This is the money trail," the banker explained. "It shows that 6 months after the collapse, Atlas Mining and Exploration declared bankruptcy and sold its territorial assets for pennies on the dollar. to a newly formed shell corporation based out of Cheyenne. 2 years later, that shell corporation was quietly acquired by a Denver-based development firm. That firm, as you already suspected, is owned by Lawrence Blackwood. The pieces locked into place. It was a meticulously planned conspiracy. Blackwood hadn't just profited from the tragedy. He had orchestrated it. He had known the mine was a death trap. He had silenced the men who tried to warn of the danger. And he had positioned himself to acquire the land and its hidden mineral wealth after the accident rendered it worthless in the public eye. Margaret, growing more desperate by the day, fed every detail of Silas's operation to Blackwood. She reported the number of men, the type of equipment, the location of the surveys. She believed she was helping him corner her foolish ex-husband, unaware that she was nothing more than a pawn, an insignificant tool for a man who had played a far more dangerous game 5 years ago. Blackwood listened to her reports with his trademark charisma, his mind working furiously. He had underestimated Silas Ward. The ruined rancher was not ruined at all. He was a ghost, returned not just to reclaim his land, but to unearth a crime Blackwood had gone to murderous lengths to bury. The hot, dry days of summer bled into one another, each one marked by the relentless sounds of construction that echoed through the valley. Silas moved through the work site with a quiet authority, his focus absolute. He was a man consumed by a single purpose, a purpose that sharpened his senses and hardened his resolve. But the past was a patient hunter, and it found him in the quiet of a moonless night. A rider from the telegraph office in the next county galloped into camp, his horse lathered and breathing hard. He carried a single, urgent telegram from Denver. Silas took it to the solitude of his canvas office, his hand steady as he tore open the envelope. The message was from his private investigator, a man named Fields, who had spent months digging into the forgotten archives of the defunct Atlas Mining Company. The words on the page seemed to leap out at him, each one a hammer blow against the fragile shell of his composure. Through Silas. Stop found him. Stop former Atlas employee. Demolitions. Expert stop confesses to planting the charge. Stop collapse was not accident. Stop dynamite. Placed strategically at base of shaft. 4 support beam. Stop order came directly from junior operations manager. Stop man was using alias. Stop real name, Lawrence Blackwood. Stop motive confirmed. Blackwood's private geological surveys showed massive unrecorded silver lode directly beneath shaft. 4. Stop he murdered them, for the silver stop. Full affidavit follows by courier Fields. Silas read the telegram once, then twice. The air in the tent grew thin, suffocating. The sounds of the night, the chirp of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote faded into a deafening roar in his ears. Collapse was not accident. The words detonated in his mind, shattering the last vestiges of a tragedy he had forced himself to accept. It wasn't negligence. It wasn't fate. It was murder. Blackwood hadn't just let them die. He had executed them. He had sentenced Mary Sarah and a dozen other innocent people to a lightless tomb for profit. The image of his daughter's hand, clutching her locket, flashed in his mind no longer just a symbol of loss, but of a calculated, monstrous crime. The grief that had been a cold, heavy stone in his gut for 5 years ignited into a white-hot rage. He was no longer just a wronged man seeking justice. He was a husband and a father, hunting the man who had murdered his family. The railroad, the depot, the fortune he had built, they were no longer just tools for uncovering a crime. They were the instruments of a deliberate and unwavering vengeance. He walked out of the tent into the cool night air, the telegram clutched in his fist. He looked up at the silhouette of the mountain, a black mass against a sea of indifferent stars. For 5 years he had mourned an accident. Now he knew the truth. And with that truth came a terrible clarity. Lawrence Blackwood would not be brought down by lawsuits and legal proceedings alone. This would end where it began, with a final, unavoidable confrontation between the man who had lost everything and the man who had taken it. The game of finance and strategy was over. A war had just been declared. Blackwood felt the ground shifting beneath him. The news of Silas paying the back taxes was an annoyance. The arrival of the work crews was a concern. But the scope and speed of the operation, coupled with the persistent, methodical geological surveys near the old Oakhaven mine, was an alarm bell he could no longer ignore. Silas Ward knew something. He was not just building a railroad. He was excavating a secret. His charismatic facade began to crack. He dispatched the man with the silver ring, a ruthless enforcer named Caleb Thorne, to send a message. It was time to move from legal maneuvering to brute force. The attack came at dusk. Eli Thompson was leading a small crew back from the foothills, their wagon loaded with core samples Silas had requested. They were navigating a narrow pass with a steep rock face on one side and a sheer drop on the other when the air was split by the sharp crack of a rifle shot. It wasn't aimed at them. It was aimed at the precariously balanced cluster of boulders high above the trail. The rock slide was instantaneous and terrifying. A river of stone and dust poured down the mountainside, the roar of it echoing through the canyon. Eli screamed a warning, whipping the horses into a desperate gallop. The wagon lurched forward, wood splintering as boulders the size of barrels crashed down around them. One massive rock struck the rear axle, shattering it and sending the wagon slewing sideways, its back end hanging precariously over the abyss. Eli was thrown clear, his shoulder hitting the canyon wall with bruising force. The other men scrambled for cover as the last of the debris thundered past. When the dust settled, the path was completely blocked, and the wagon with its precious cargo of geological evidence was moments from plunging into the ravine. Silas and his main crew heard the explosion from the main camp and arrived within minutes. He took in the scene at a glance, the terrified men, the wrecked wagon, and Eli struggling to his feet, his arm hanging at an unnatural angle. But it was the sight of a single fresh hoofprint in the soft earth near the top of the pass that confirmed his fears. This was no accident. Rage, cold and precise, settled over him. This was Blackwood's response. He was trying to destroy the evidence and intimidate his workers. He had almost killed the only friend Silas had left in the world. "Now get him back to camp." Silas ordered, his voice dangerously quiet, as two men helped a groaning Eli. "The rest of you secure that wagon. I want every rock sample salvaged." He did not raise his voice. He did not issue threats. But as his men worked frantically with ropes and pulleys to save the wagon, they saw a transformation in him. The quiet, calculating businessman was gone, replaced by a leader whose presence commanded absolute loyalty. He moved with a newfound purpose, his dormant instincts from a younger, harder life reawakening. He was no longer just the planner. He was the protector. That night, Silas gathered his most trusted men, the foreman, and a half-dozen others who had proven their mettle. "Blackwood knows we're getting close," he told them, his face illuminated by the flickering light of a lantern. "He tried to kill my men and destroy our work tonight. It won't be the last time. From now on, this camp is on a war footing. Post sentries. No one enters or leaves without my permission. Work continues, but everyone carries a rifle." He was no longer playing a strategic game of ledgers and deeds. Blackwood had made it physical. He had brought violence into the valley. And Silas Ward, the man who had lost his family to a calculated act of violence, was now prepared to meet it head-on. He looked out into the darkness in the direction of Blackwood's temporary residence in town. The time for subtlety was over. Blackwood had drawn a line in the dirt with blood and rock, and Silas was about to cross it. The storm rolled in from the north, a bruised and angry mass of clouds that swallowed the stars and unleashed a torrent of wind and rain. It was the kind of night that felt like a prelude to violence, with the wind howling through the unfinished frame of the railroad depot like a tormented spirit. Inside lanterns cast long dancing shadows that twisted the half-built structures into monstrous shapes. This was where it would end. A message had arrived earlier. Blackwood wanted a meeting. He was coming to the depot alone to make a final offer. Silas knew it was a lie. He had spent the day making his own preparations. He stood in the center of the vast cavernous space, the wind tearing at his coat. Eli, his arm in a sling, but his eyes fierce, stood guard at the main entrance, a shotgun resting in the crook of his good arm. Hidden in the shadows of the upper scaffolding and behind stacks of lumber were a dozen of Silas's most loyal men armed and waiting. Right on cue, a carriage appeared through the sheeting rain, its lamps cutting a weak path through the gloom. Blackwood stepped out, but he was not alone. Behind him were Caleb Thorne and 5 other hired guns, their hands resting on the pistols at their belts. And clutching Margaret's arm, pulling her from the carriage into the storm, was Blackwood himself. Her face was a mask of terror and confusion. He was using her as a shield, as leverage. "Ward." Blackwood's voice boomed over the wind, laced with triumphant arrogance. "I admire your persistence, I truly do. But this little enterprise of yours is over." They strode into the depot, the gunmen fanning out their weapons drawn. Margaret stumbled, her fine dress soaked and splattered with mud. "You brought my ex-wife to a business meeting, Blackwood?" Silas asked, his voice calm, cutting through the gale. "That's poor form." "She's a partner." Blackwood sneered, shoving her forward. "A partner who has finally seen the error of her ways. She's here to witness you sign these deeds over to me. You will relinquish all claims to this valley, the railroad contract, everything. In return, I'll let you and your men walk away." It was then, in the flickering lantern light, that Margaret finally understood. She saw the coldness in Blackwood's eyes, the casual cruelty in his grip. She heard the barely concealed threat in his voice. This wasn't business. It was something far darker. "You're a fool if you think I'll sign anything," Silas said. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, I think you will. You see, I know what you've been digging for. You're chasing ghosts, Ward. But you have no proof. Just a few rocks and some hearsay. I, on the other hand, have men with guns." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, loud enough for Margaret to hear. It was a brilliant plan, a small, unfortunate accident that cleared the way for real progress. That mine was a gold-lined tomb, and your family paid the price of admission. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The horrifying truth crashed down on her. The scorn, the mockery, the petty financial revenge she had sought, it was all meaningless in the face of this monstrous revelation. She looked at Silas, truly seeing him for the first time, and saw not a failed husband, but a man carrying an unimaginable burden of grief. It wasn't just an accident. Silas said, his voice resonating with 5 years of suppressed fury. It was murder, and I do have proof. He held up a thick oilcloth packet. The sworn affidavit from the demolitionist who planted your dynamite, Blackwood, and the original untampered geological surveys showing the silver lode you killed my family for. A train carrying the territorial marshal is due at my new station at dawn. This evidence is for him. Blackwood's face contorted with rage. The mask of civility was gone. "Kill him," he snarled at Thorne. "Kill them all." As the gunmen raised their pistols, Silas made his move. He stomped his boot down on a loose floorboard. It was a trigger, A thin wire connected to it ran into the shadows. A small, precisely placed dynamite charge, the one his investigator's confession had detailed, erupted at the far end of the depot. The explosion was not designed to kill, but to create chaos. A section of scaffolding collapsed, crates toppled, and half the lanterns were extinguished, plunging the depot into a maelstrom of darkness, dust, and confusion. Blackwood was separated from his men. In the disarray, Thorne lunged for Silas. As he raised his pistol, Margaret, acting on pure redemptive instinct, grabbed a heavy iron lantern and swung it with all her might, crashing it against the side of Thorne's head. He staggered back, stunned, giving Silas the opening he needed. Silas disarmed him with two swift, brutal blows. The fight devolved into a desperate brawl in the half-light. But Silas, fueled by a righteous fury, moved through the chaos with deadly efficiency. He was no longer a businessman. He was a force of nature. He finally cornered Blackwood against a support pillar, and the barrel of Thorne's pistol pressed hard under his chin. The developer's face was a mess of terror and disbelief. "You can't," he whimpered. "You're a civilized man." For a heart-stopping moment, Silas was tempted. The face of his daughter, her small hand clutching the locket, filled his vision. Vengeance was a breath away. He could pull the trigger and end it, repaying murder with murder. But as he looked at the cowering man, he saw not a monster worthy of his rage, but a pathetic, greedy coward. He pulled the locket from his own pocket, its cool metal a grounding force in his hand. His daughter deserved more than vengeance. She deserved justice. "No," Silas said, his voice raw. "I'm not you." Just as he spoke, a piercing whistle cut through the storm. The dawn train arriving early. Bright lights flooded the depot entrance as the territorial marshal and a squad of deputies, drawn by the sound of the explosion, burst in with rifles ready. "It's over, Blackwood," Silas said, holding the trembling man at gunpoint as the lawmen surrounded them. Justice had arrived right on schedule. The storm broke with the dawn, washing the valley clean. In the quiet, dripping aftermath, the railroad depot was a scene of controlled chaos. The marshal's deputies led Blackwood, Thorne, and their bruised and beaten gunmen away in chains. The evidence Silas provided, the affidavit, the forged safety reports, the financial records, and the new geological surveys, was sealed and taken as official territorial business. A conviction was all but certain. Silas stood amidst the wreckage of the depot, the oilcloth packet containing his life's purpose now in the marshal's hands. He felt a profound emptiness, the fire of his 5-year quest extinguished, leaving behind only the cold ashes of his grief. Margaret approached him, her steps hesitant. Her expensive dress was ruined, her hair matted with rain and dirt. The facade of the proud, scornful woman she had been was stripped away, leaving only a humbled, shame-faced stranger. "I never knew Silas," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I thought it was about money, about pride." She looked around at the foundations of the town. He was building a town born from a tragedy she had been blind to. "All this time, you were carrying that." "It was always about them, Margaret," he replied, his voice weary but clear. "It was always for them." She didn't ask for forgiveness. She knew she didn't deserve it. The chasm between them was too vast, built not on misunderstandings about wealth, but on a fundamental failure of her character. She had judged his worth by the contents of his wallet, while he had measured his life by the memory of a lost love. "I'm leaving," she said simply. "I'll sell the house. There's nothing for me here anymore." She finally understood that she had no place in the world he was building, a world founded on a love and loyalty she had never truly understood. She turned and walked away. without looking back, a small, solitary figure disappearing into the pale morning light. Their story was over, not with anger or recrimination, but with a quiet, somber finality. 6 months later, the valley was reborn. The railroad junction was complete, a bustling hub of commerce and travel. A new town had sprung up around it with a general store, a blacksmith, a hotel, and neat rows of houses. Freight trains rumbled through daily, their whistles a sound of progress, not mourning. On the sign at the entrance to town, freshly painted letters spelled out its name, Sarah's Crossing. Silas Ward was not the reclusive tycoon the territory expected him to be. He was a quiet, respected leader, the chairman of the town council, a man who invested his profits back into the community he had created. The rage that had driven him was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding sense of peace. He had not found happiness, but he had found purpose. The final scene of his long journey took place on a windswept hill overlooking the town. In the newly consecrated cemetery, 3 simple granite headstones stood side by side, bearing the names Mary Ward, Sarah Ward, and Eli Thompson. His old friend had passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 months prior, having lived long enough to see Silas's mission completed and the valley thrive. Silas stood before the graves, the autumn wind rustling the tall grass around him. From his vest pocket, he took out the small silver locket that had been his constant companion for 5 years. With infinite tenderness, he polished its surface with his thumb, before gently placing it on the grassy mound of his daughter's grave. It was time to let it rest. As he stood there, a small boy, the son of one of his railroad workers, approached him shyly. The boy held out a single bright, yellow wild daisy. He said nothing, simply offering the flower. Silas looked down at the child's trusting face, and for the first time in over 5 years, a small, genuine smile touched his lips. He accepted the daisy, his fingers brushing the boy's. He looked out over Sarah's Crossing at the smoke curling from chimneys, the sound of children's laughter carrying on the breeze, the steady, rhythmic chuff of a train pulling into the depot. He had built it all not for wealth or for revenge, but as a living testament to the family he had lost. His legacy would not be one of tragedy, but of life, community, and hope, blossoming in the unforgiving soil where his heart had been broken. He had finally come home,